On inheriting his father's titles, wealth and lands, Viscount Benedict Clemenson Wright had gone on one of the longest benders in the history of minor aristocracy. He'd quaffed, he'd guzzled, he'd scoffed, he'd devoured, he'd bonked, he'd boffed, he'd toked, he'd snorted. In short, he'd had a bloody good time. But eventually the money ran out, and Benedict went on to accrue a number of eye-watering debts. Prison was his final, inevitable destination. 5 years later, thanks to the tireless efforts of his prison counsellor, Benedict was offered and accepted a position as a municipal cleaner on the manicured streets of the charming market town of Speckham. It didn't take long for Benedict to start finding the job tedious in the extreme. 8 minutes, to be exact. At least the meagre wages paid for his small bedsit and his only real comfort, the occasional bottle of wine. Benedict spent a great deal of his time rather pathetically mooning over Violetta Pebmarsh Wicks, his ex-fiancée. How badly he had treated her, how unfaithful he had been. And as with all attainable things which become overwhelmingly desirable when they become unattainable, like cheese and onion crisps, for example, or oxygen, in Benedict's mind, Violetta had gradually taken on the status of a saint. Since leaving prison, he had sent her long, rambling emails expressing his deep regret and beseeching her to forgive him. She never replied. Poor Benedict. Well, actually, not poor Benedict. He'd been an utter dickwad, but, you know. Every day, when he wasn't skiving off, lying in bed playing Candy Crush, Benedict would begrudgingly set off on his street-cleaning round. And on that round, there was one particular large, old, broken-down house which oozed a sense of menace. The man from down the off-licence informed Benedict that it was definitely haunted. Benedict pooh-poohed the idea. He'd been brought up in a 15th century castle, and the only scary thing he'd ever seen was one Christmas Eve when he caught the butler serving the master of the hounds in the kitchen. He seemed to remember brandy butter being involved. Time passed. Slowly. One day, to Benedict's amazement and delight, Violetta contacted him. In her email, she spoke movingly of how badly her heart had been broken, how impossible it had proved for her to love again, and, incidentally, when he said, as he had in his last email, that he wished he could spend the money that he'd spent on himself on her. How could he do that? Wasn't he entirely penniless now? Benedict's heart raced. She had actually acknowledged his existence. He replied immediately, repeating his declarations of sorrow and regret, and then breezily added that, believe it or not, he had secretly hidden away a large amount of money before he'd gone to prison. Then, without pausing for even a second, he clicked send, which was a very silly thing to do. There was no hidden money. He was flat broke. But that didn't bother Benedict. He'd deal with all that later. Somehow. The next day he set off on his round. In his happy rapture, he absent-mindedly pursued a wayward plastic bag. It blew along the road, through a rusty gate, down an overgrown garden path, ending up into a window with a broken latch. Gosh! He'd actually wandered right up to the so-called haunted house. He was just about to turn round when he heard a very faint moaning. Curious, he made his way down the side of the building until he came to a window with a broken latch. Reaching through and opening it, he climbed into the house. And what a decrepit old gaff it was, too. Cold and damp, wreathed in cobwebs, it was a veritable citadel of decay. Kevin MacLeod would have loved it. Slowly, tentatively, Benedict made his way towards the sound until he found himself in a large, gloomy room, at the end of which, in an enormous wing-arm chair, sat the spectral figure of a cadaverous old man. Benedict gasped. It was looking very much as if the stories were true after all. Slowly, the figure lifted a stick-thin arm and pointed a twig-thin finger, at the end of which grew a thorn-thin nail, and from deep in the figure's rasping throat came the voice of the grave.
You dare to come here?
Squeaked Benedict. I'm sorry. I thought someone needed help.
Help?
Wheezed the spectre.
I don't need help. I need pickled onions.
Pickled, stammered Benedict.
Onions, you cretin! Onions! I've run out. You haven't got any, have you?
You're not actually a ghost, are you? Quavered Benedict.
Of course I'm not a ghost,
snapped the figure.
Do I look like a ghost?
Well, said Benedict. So they got to talking. Benedict learned that the old man had decided some years ago to withdraw completely from society. Humankind was beyond redemption in his eyes.
Fools and vagabonds,
he thundered.
Liars and cheats.
The old man, it seemed, loved pickled onions with a passion. So much so that he had recently exhausted his supply. He was at his wits' end. Would Benedict do him the kindness of bringing him some? Benedict agreed. Although, of course, he had no intention of keeping his word. After all, what was in it for him? But then, Benedict found out exactly what was in it for him. For in his gratitude, the old man produced a very fine bottle of Chateau de Conriche and poured Benedict a large glass. Benedict loved a fine wine, and sipping at the velvety brew, he concluded that this was a very fine wine indeed. Before taking his leave, Benedict promised he would come back the very next day with a jar of pickled onions. As he left, he passed a large reinforced door with a sign on it saying simply, "Keep out." I wonder what's in there, thought Benedict idly. The very next day, Benedict returned with the pickled onions. The old man was very grateful indeed, and repaid him by sharing a glass or two of a very acceptable Côte de Grandasse. When Benedict got home, he found to his joy that Violetta had sent another email. Oh, how the tone had changed since Benedict's mention of the money. They must meet, she said, perhaps at the Golden Snail restaurant. She'd heard it was very good. Benedict quailed. The Golden Snail restaurant was quite the most shishy and overpriced eatery in the entire county. He needed funds, and quickly. Desperate, Benedict was obliged to visit a local backstreet payday loan company, which very obligingly was prepared to give him a usable credit card that very day. The next day, lured again by the temptation of a decent glass of plonk, Benedict visited the old man, taking him a jar of his favourite pickled onions. The afternoon passed as companionably as it could between an embittered old misanthrope and a feckless toff. And as they drank, the old man started opening up. It appeared he had once been a well-known art and antique dealer, but he'd made few friends in the business.
Knobs,
he slurred,
with their cliques and their petty judgments. I collected the finest artifacts and works of art known to mankind. I put on exhibitions and they mocked me, said I had no aesthetic insight, that I was mad. Mad! But I have the last laugh now. Which reminds me, he added, I just have to check on something. You stay here.
And with that, he staggered out of the room. Benedict was intrigued. Emboldened by a belly full of vin d'expressive, he followed. He watched the old man weaving his way towards the mysterious door, upon which was the sign saying, "Keep out," and observed with bleary-eyed fascination, as he pressed the heel of his palm against a spot halfway down the wall by the door, and then jabbed a bony finger at another point higher up. And with those two precise, well-practiced moves, there was a loud click, and the heavy door opened. The old man lurched in. Benedict quietly tiptoed to the door's entrance and peered in. His heart nearly stopped, for the old man was stood in the middle of a huge array of fabulous objects, an Aladdin's cave of unimaginable preciousness. But barely had Benedict had the chance to take it all in when the old man turned to leave. Taking one last incredulous look, Benedict retraced his steps as quickly and quietly as possible. Later that afternoon, Benedict stumbled out into the fading light. But burned into his mind's eye was the sight of that magnificent treasure trove. Saturday came. A majorly made-over and clean-shaven Benedict met with Violetta at the Golden Snail restaurant. Benedict spoke fervently about how he was a reformed man now. "I'm a reformed man now," he said. "Oh, really?" For deafs. I'm doing a lot of work in the community. For the community, Natch." "How sweet. I'd love to hear all about it. But first, I must tell you about this simply perfect dress I saw at the new Fifi Culotte exhibition." "Yeah?" "Yeah. Oh, but Bobo, before that, you must hear about this too wonderful little villa my friend Freddie's put up for sale in the Antibes. Have you ever been to the Antibes?" "Oh, lobster! Oh, I adore lobster. I say, shall we have another bottle of Giggles?" As the champagne flowed, Benedict became more and more reckless. "You shall have a whole wardrobe full of Fifi Culotte frocks, my darling," he vowed. "And if your friend Freddie sells that villa to anyone else, he'll be answering to me." By the end of the evening, Violetta had every reason to believe that Benedict was totally and utterly minted to the max. The bill came. Benedict excused himself, went to the gents, and bathed copiously. He came back, handed over his credit card, and almost fainted with relief when the enormous payment was accepted. He then poured a very tipsy Violetta into a cab, at his expense, after queasily agreeing to her insistence that she come and visit him next week at his place. Benedict was in a bit of a tight spot, that was for sure. But just how tight a spot he was about to discover. For when he arrived back home, he was greeted by the sight of all his meagre possessions piled carelessly outside with a note from his landlord saying that he'd been evicted for non-payment of rent. Under that note was a letter from the council terminating his employment contract due to persistent absenteeism, and under that was a hand-delivered letter from the loan company stating that they noted that he had exceeded his overdraft, and unless the balance plus interest was received in the next 24 hours, he would be receiving a visit from a repayment enforcer who went under the name of Big Mike. Benedict spent an uncomfortable night under a bench. Could things get any worse? Yes, they could. He needed cash, lots of it, and the old fella was his only chance. He stumbled round to the house of the old man, who at first struggled to recognize Benedict without his beard. He explained his predicament, reasoned with him, pleaded with him, begged him. Please, was there any way he could help him out? The response? Stony silence. Benedict, quite frankly, totally lost his shit. I know all about your treasure. How could you be so greedy, so selfish? I mean, what kind of a monster are you to let a pal suffer? And yes, I am a pal, a true pal. How many pickled onions have I brought you? Dozens. But now that I need a little favour back... Benedict worked himself into such a lather that it wasn't long before he was attempting to drag the old man in the direction of the treasure room. But as hard as Benedict pulled, the old man pulled back just as hard the other way, with all his curmudgeonly, pig-headed might. After some minutes of this furious tug-of-war, Benedict could feel his grip slipping until he lost it altogether, and the old man went shooting backwards at some speed. It was the pickled onion on the floor what done him, causing him to slip wildly, sending him high into the air, and then down with an almighty crack, head first. The old man was dead. Benedict's ragged, shocked breathing was the only sound in the cavernous old house. His phone rang. It was Violetta. She had made up her mind. She had packed a bag and was about to get into a cab and come to him. What was his address? In an instant, all of his confusion evaporated. What was he thinking? His own true love was coming back to him. An absolute fortune was all his. This was how things should be. Yes, come to me. Come to me now, he cried. And without further ado, he gave her the old man's address. Time was very much of the essence. So much to do. Tidy the house, open the treasure room, and of course, bury the old man's body. But Benedict was extremely squeamish. Okay, bury the body in a minute. Open the treasure room first. He rushed to the wall by the treasure room door. He tapped, he prodded, he punched, he kicked, but no matter what pressure he applied, the door simply would not open. And then, before he knew it, she was here. He hauled the old man's corpse to the nearest cabinet, stuffed him in and jammed the doors shut, just in the nick of time. Violetta's smile of loving adoration faded as she entered the house. I see, she said, her voice hard and jarring. And you have money, do you? Living in a hovel like this? I don't think so. I have treasure. Treasure? She sneered. What treasure? Benedict was just about to tell her exactly what kind of treasure, when, to their utter horror, the cabinet door very slowly creaked open, and out flopped the body of the old man. Violetta gasped, stiff with terror. Police! And with that, she fainted. Benedict nearly fainted himself. There was only one chance now. He had to show Violetta that treasure. That would surely help her to put things into perspective. If his attempts to find the secret spots in the wall had been desperate before Violetta had arrived, they were utterly frantic now. He launched a full-on assault at the wall, thrashing and flailing at it like a madman. Violetta, meanwhile, had been slowly coming to, and now saw her chance. Leaping to her feet, she drew back a dainty boot as far as she could and kicked Benedict quite spectacularly in the wrinkles. Benedict bent double. His bottom hit a point halfway down the door, and then his head hit a point above it. And as he slid to the floor, a loud click was heard, and the door swung open. Violetta stood gaping at the array of fantastic wonders before her. She bent forward and scooped up a large armful of coins and jewellery, groaning with orgiastic ecstasy, and then stopped. She let the treasure fall keeping hold of one gold coin. She picked at it. Gold-coloured foil peeled away to reveal ancient dried-out waxy chocolate. She scooped up some jewels. They were cut glass. Benedict joined her. They feverishly examined object after object. Everything, every single thing in the room was tacky, gaudy, worthless tat. And then the old man's words came back to Benedict.
They called me mad! Mad!
Violetta stood slowly, as did a horrified Benedict. You, she said very quietly, are so going back to prison, and made to leave. Benedict tried to stop her. They struggled violently, both of them falling hard against the door, which promptly shut with a soft click. They froze. The door had no inside handle. A soft giggling came quietly from the dark at the back of the room.
Who's there?
Asked Benedict in hushed terror. From the shadows emerged none other than the old man, his neck lolling at a most unusual angle.
I thought you were dead,
whispered Benedict.
I am,
said the old man.
Thanks to you. Funny, isn't it? I spent all these years making out the house was haunted with strange lights and mysterious noises. And now it really is. By me. And by you too in a little while.
And that's when Benedict and Violetta started screaming. Well, what have we learned here? We have learned that you must never, ever underestimate just how dangerous a pickled onion can be.